Welcome to Heavy Networking from the Packet Pushers Podcast Network. Today's episode covers virtual patching plus Palo Alto Networks' new announcement about guided virtual patching. And if you don't know what virtual patching is, I hadn't run into it either before doing my homework for the show, and it's kind of cool. I'm Ethan Banks, along with Drew Conway Murray. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and the Packet Pushers Community Slack group. You can visit packetpushers.net to make all of that a bit easier to find. Our guest today from Palo Alto Networks is Kalyan Siddam, Director of Product Management for IoT OT Security. Kalyan, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And man, we got to open up by talking through the vulnerability patching problem, the problem that I think most of us are familiar with, but we should talk through it anyway. And then the Palo Alto Network solution for this called virtual patching.
Yeah, when it comes to vulnerabilities, one of the biggest problem in the context of OT and IoT is that too many vulnerabilities on many of these mission critical IoT, OT devices in your environment. There is a lot that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of understanding what are those vulnerabilities, which systems they are impacting, how business critical these devices are, and in terms of vulnerabilities, which of those vulnerabilities could be actively exploited, what may be their EPSS score, and are those devices actually connected to the internet, and what may be the attack vector, and so on and so forth, right? Pulling it all together and understanding and coming up with a meaningful priority, taking into consideration of the asset and their context, and as well as what type of mitigation controls that you may have in place. And it is a huge challenge because a lot of times it involves stitching together information from multiple data sources and then finally coming up with meaningful action plan. That's really is a huge problem. That's where I think the virtual patching that Palo Alto Networks is able to offer is a huge benefit for many of you guys that are listening to this conversation today.
So I understand we're going to be talking in the context of IoT and OT, and that's going to be interesting because that's a space that I'm getting more and more interested in. But the concept of virtual patching, what does that mean as opposed to a traditional patch?
Okay, traditional patching would require, once you have made that assessment on which of these vulnerabilities are highest priority, and then you were starting to think about, okay, I need to schedule some kind of a software update that addresses that vulnerability, and you have to schedule maintenance for those devices, impacted devices, and then be able to apply the software updates and validate them to make sure everything is okay and stuff, right? When we are talking about these mission critical environments, which are required to be up and running pretty much 24/7, and finding that type of a maintenance window for broad number of OT, IoT devices in the environment, we are looking at really a huge maintenance window, potentially longer downtimes, and that's impacting revenue, impacting the availability of these systems and so on, right? That is a huge problem. That's where compared to those regular patching in terms that involves actually touching the devices and then applying the patches and so on, the virtual patching is, on the other hand, can be applied at a larger scale at the network level using IDS and IPS kind of technologies, intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems technologies to effectively block any of those exploits coming into your network and attacking your IoT OT devices.
So how would you distinguish virtual patching from sort of, non-patch related remediations?
Yes, that's a great question. So some of the non-patch related remediations could be that, hey, this particular device has a known vulnerability that is exploited only through this specific application when it is configured in certain manner, for example. Those type of non-patch related mitigations could be applied by changing the configuration of the device, by potentially disabling the service that may not be necessarily required for the device to function. One classic example could be that you have a SMB vulnerability that is essentially could be leveraged and attacked on the devices, IoT, OT devices. You could potentially switch to a different version of that protocol, same functionality, but more secure, that effectively mitigates the problem and eliminating that vulnerability.
So I haven't changed any software. I've just done a configuration change. But
Absolutely.
with virtual patching, I guess that's where I'm trying to find out what the difference is. What am I doing with virtual patching? You mentioned IPS, so it sounds like I'm doing something in line with actual traffic going to the endpoint device.
That's right. Effectively, that's right. Yeah. When it comes to other options, whether you're updating the software or changing the configuration of the device, you're essentially touching those devices by making modifications to the configuration or actually updating the software. Whereas with the virtual patching, you're applying this at the network level, wherein you have let's say you have a IDS IPS solution built into your firewalls. Palo Alto is known for those industry-leading IDS IPS solutions. We are able to basically effectively apply the patch at the network traffic level because the firewall is deployed in line and we are inspecting every traffic coming in and out of your network. We can identify those threats coming into your network and block those threats so that those vulnerabilities could not be exploited.
So you compared it to IDS IPS technology, Kalyan. So is Palo Alto Networks making the virtual patches available to me then? There's something that's going to show up in my policy console.
That's right. So in the context of IoT, OT security, what we have done in recently is that we not only identified the vulnerabilities that are impacting your devices in your network, all the assets that are on your network, we are showing what type of priority that is applied to them based on the severity of the vulnerability, which business critical systems they are on, and how easy it is to be exploited by looking at the dark web, where we are able to identify a given vulnerability, who are the malicious actors or APT groups that are able to or that are actively exploiting, are there known exploit kits available and such. What we are basically now doing is that on top of that visual presentation of which of these IoT OT devices have such vulnerabilities that could be exploited, we are now showing on top of it, showing that which of those vulnerabilities could be actually have protections built in our firewall, in our IDS IPS solution. By combining that visibility with the devices that are vulnerable and which vulnerabilities exist, and now showing up on the other side in terms of which of those vulnerabilities could be effectively prevented by our IDS IPS solution, kind of brings it all together to show not only the visibility of the vulnerabilities, but also showing you that which of those vulnerabilities are effectively can be protected by meaningfully deploying those capabilities that are existing on the firewall.
Okay, there's a lot of data there, and one of the big data points is my Palo Alto Networks devices seem to know which endpoints need to be protected, what the vulnerabilities are. So how would Palo know that? Is there scanning that's being done against endpoints or something to know that, oh, you're running this version of code, the Linux OS, let's say, that's got these known CVEs? Is it something like that?
Not quite. But that's one thing in the OT mission critical environments and generally IoT environments is that you cannot scan your networks or these devices to discover these vulnerabilities because they are effectively could kill the device and they can shut down or interfere with their functionality of those devices.
Yeah.
What we are doing from Palo Alto Network Security Platform point of view is that our firewalls are inspecting the traffic going in and out of these devices. During that passive inspection of the network traffic, we are able to apply AI/ML technologies to identify what those devices are for each of those IP address that we are inspecting traffic from. We are able to identify and say, hey, this is actually a Siemens PLC or a GE X-ray machine or an IoT camera, and identify what type of device it is. And based on the same network traffic inspection and using our DPI engine and applying AI, we're able to even identify what software versions are running on those devices, right? That's primarily our mechanism for discovering what software is running. Based on that, we are able to identify what vulnerabilities exist. Recently, we have also added additional capabilities in our IoT OT security solution is that we are able to extract the information about these device and the software versions through other existing tools that customers may have for device management, for example, and such, to be able to collect that additional context to more accurately identify software versions and more accurately confirming or eliminating any vulnerabilities that potentially exists on those IoT OT devices as well.
So if I've got an asset or inventory management problem software set designed for OT products, that I could maybe import that, you're saying, into my firewall to say be on the lookout for traffic going to these type of devices?
That's right. Yeah. So our IoT OT security solution is a cloud delivered security solution on top of our firewalls. We are able to effectively integrate with many third-party systems along with inspection of the traffic to identify the devices and the software versions to confirm or eliminate the vulnerabilities that exist.
Okay, so two things. You're able to do fingerprinting based on network traffic, and then also you can incorporate third-party information from asset or inventory systems.
That's right, as a complementary source, yes.
Yeah.
Enforcement points, firewalls, obviously. Could there be enforcement points in the cloud? Agents running on endpoints? I guess an OT, agents on endpoints isn't much of a thing, but still, where are our different enforcement options?
Yeah. I think the traditional approach has been that you passively identify these devices and then enforce security policy right on the firewall itself. Having a agent installed on the endpoint itself is typically not a best practice or feasible option, primarily because these OT, IoT devices are legacy systems. They have very limited footprint in terms of being able to run with potentially memory demanding or CPU demanding agent software that could interfere with their functionality and such. So the best practice is to look at the protection of these devices at the network level using firewall-like solutions, essentially.
Yeah, and just so folks have context here, we're not just talking about security cameras and printers. We're talking about industrial control systems that might be running manufacturing systems, oil and gas, very sensitive
Absolutely.
temperature and monitoring systems.
And some of these devices are, decades old, right? They
Right.
have been running for many, many, many decades, and installing a new software elements on it, you're taking a huge risk on potentially interfering with their functionality. And typically, the OEM vendors that manufacture these OT devices or any IoT device do not allow or guarantee their functionality if you were to install a aftermarket software on those devices.
So anytime I'm talking about IPS, IDS, there's an issue around false positives. What are my virtual deployment options? What are my virtual patching deployment options? Can I do monitor only, or is this block or nothing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, from a identification of the vulnerabilities point of view, we are doing a great due diligence in terms of finding and collecting all kinds of data sources to accurately identify if that vulnerability is active on that device or not. On top of it, for customers who are running mission critical devices, and we are taking very conservative approach to how you would go about blocking these vulnerabilities, there is certainly a option for alert only mode where you can identify the traffic. If there is any potential exploit being launched, you would get notified when such an attempt is being made instead of actually blocking the exploit coming in, right? That way, customers could be informed of, hey, there is potential exploit coming in. We see that traffic. You could then trigger packet captures or do additional investigation to say, hey, now that I see such an attempt happening, what type of remediation action or response that I would want to incorporate in those things. It's again boils down to the risk appetite and the mission criticality of these devices and the environments that customers are running in.
So if I've got an IDS IPS solution of some kind, is virtual patching complementary to that, or is it actually part of the IDS IPS? How does it work?
It is actually, I would say it's a part of, and the where the complementary nature comes in is that identifying and showing that yes, every IDS IPS systems can claim that yes, I can protect you from known vulnerabilities, but the coverage can vary in terms of which of these particular vulnerabilities you have coverage for, which signatures that you have, right? Where the value comes in terms of what we are as a Palo Alto Networks delivering from our network security is that platform is that giving you the visibility of not only the vulnerabilities and also transparently sharing which of those vulnerabilities have protections in our IDS IPS to inform the customer that these are the places that you have protections for. And if you don't have protections coverage for, you can start to plan and take necessary actions, right? There are things in terms of, hey, virtual patching is one aspect of protection. Again, we believe in protection by layers. One of the other approach customers could take is that implementing the least privilege access control policies, which we within our IoT OT security solution can recommend to even reduce attack surface to begin with, right? That way, it can help customers to understand the vulnerabilities, look at all the different ways that they can go about actually securing these environments.
Yeah, it's a more integrated system that ties directly to the actual end hosts that are being protected. So you have a more holistic view of what's going on.
That's
Not
exactly
just,
it.
I saw this traffic go through and it matched an IPS signature, and so I took an action. It's more, here's your risk profile. Here's what you're looking at with these endpoints that need to be protected, and here's the virtual patches that we've put in place to help protect you. So you have it again, tying it to the endpoint is a big deal. So many of the IDSs that I've worked with over the years are just, they're kind of blind. They don't really integrate. They're in line. They have a job to do, but they don't really know much about the endpoints. And so
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
just there flashing alerts and alarms and doing the thing and making a lot of noise. And sometimes you care and sometimes you wish they'd quiet down a bit.
Yeah,
But
that's where I
tying it
think
back to the endpoints matters.
exactly right, Ethan. So that's where the guided virtual patching comes very, very handy in the sense like let's say you have a different risk appetite for a mission critical OT device that's controlling, let's say, a furnace system, or you have a different risk appetite, obviously, for a different class of OT devices and such, right, in the customer environment. Having this guided virtual patching workflow that surfaces the vulnerabilities and gives customers an option in terms of, to Drew's point, in terms of, hey, do you want to just get alerted for these particular vulnerabilities and the protections that you want to apply as you get ready, understanding the risk, and then start to maybe think about actually blocking them, versus do you want to right away go with a block posture, right, for those vulnerabilities that are coming in, primarily maybe because of the block is adequate response or right response for your organization and for your particular OT environment that you may be looking at in devices.
So we just spent a little bit of time getting some background on virtual patching, which has been helpful. And now I guess Palo Alto Networks has announced guided virtual patching, which sounds like an extension of virtual patching. Can you sort of walk us through what the difference is?
Yeah. So as we were talking a little bit earlier, right? So you could make a decision to, as a blanket, apply and enable IDS IPS and apply the virtual patching that way and say, yes, I have somehow the protections applied and such, right? But now Ethan also kind of called out earlier that those IDS IPS solutions not necessarily have protections for every single vulnerability, right? In terms of which particular vulnerabilities are being protected and on what class of devices. You're kind of apply and kind of basically pray, yes, I may be protected. You don't have a lot of information in terms of being able to get a better understanding of how accurate, how better is your security posture. That's where this guided virtual patching comes in, where we are bringing the context of the asserts, they're bringing the context of the vulnerabilities on these asserts, and then showing you options in terms of which of these vulnerabilities are actually protected by our firewalls, and give you options in terms of what type of action you want to take when certain vulnerability is going to be triggered in your network in terms of block or alert and such. And
So instead of applying a sort of blanket set of rules, maybe even by sector or something, I can say, I know I have these assets with this sort of risk profile specifically in my organization. I want these very specific rule sets in my IDS IPS to address them. That's what guided virtual patching is.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's where the guided virtual patching comes in. And after you apply the virtual patching, now given we have the knowledge about which device classes or device types have the virtual patching enabled, we can even effectively show the reduced risk scores in terms of, hey, this particular vulnerability is already being protected. Now I don't need to raise the risk score for this device because there is a mitigation action that is effectively blocking this vulnerability. So the impact of this vulnerability is no longer high, it may be low. Again, we could even adjust that based on customers' willingness, based on how they want to acknowledge this vulnerability has been kind of mitigated within the visibility as well.
Well, as I was reading the announcement, Kai, and there's a an AI component to the guided virtual patching as well. And I don't think I heard you say AI yet. You got to say it.
I haven't said that enough. I think that's one aspect about the whole AI is become a huge buzzword right now. Recently with Gen AI and ChatGPT and whatnot. But Palo Alto has been doing this for many, many, many years before people starting to notice AI, right? If you look at it, that's one of the things that we have done and elevated that in our customers' knowledge is that we have now many advanced security subscriptions on our firewall. That's basically what we are calling it as precision AI that protects customers from all kinds of threat vectors, whether it is the URL that you're basically accessing, or whether it is the binaries that are being exchanged on your network, or the IDS IPS itself, right? Because a lot of times you are thinking about IDS IPS based on signatures and being able to detect the exploits. But with our precision AI technology, what we are basically looking at is even the zero-day threats that we haven't seen, right? Instead of having a patient zero all the time, we are able to apply protections by identifying these potential malicious activities even before they become a problem or having a patient zero. Yeah. That's, I think, is a huge differentiator in terms of being able to have that type of technology built into your firewall and being now able to have visibility to vulnerabilities and then adjust all that that you can leverage in your security.
This is the sort of AI and ML that's been around in security and SecOps for a while now. This is predates LLMs. It's looking at transactions that are going across the wire and seeing what can be inferred. Wait, this is like you said, zero day. There's a threat here. There's something that we have just identified based on, what we know about tons and tons and tons of traffic we're seeing. I don't know if it's globally. Are you taking in feeds globally if customers opt into that or?
That's right. Yeah, this is a global install base of customers. But again, the way the LLMs are being trained for our precision AI technology is that we are able to kind of leverage tremendous petabytes of data that passing through our customers and the firewalls that we are protecting our customers' network with. And we are able to kind of monitor the network traffic and basically train our LLMs to be able to identify for detection and blocking of these threats.
Right. So you've added LLMs to the AI and ML work that you've been doing for years. LLMs are now part of it.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So can you sort of talk about how this fits into my security operations? Am I just sort of expecting these new filters or signatures to show up automatically? How do I incorporate them into my workflow? Do I need to do any risk assessment on my own? How does it, fit into sort of the daily SecOps work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two angles to this. One from a risk assessment point of view, as I said, we are basically constantly looking at our device classification and then constantly looking at known vulnerabilities that are being published. And that's one thing in terms of being able to inform customers in terms of all the different types of IoT OT assets that they have on the network, and then identifying which vulnerabilities are there and providing a more meaningful assessment in terms of taking into consideration multiple dimensions of the information, right? In terms of, is this a high severity vulnerability? Is it on a high critical asset that you have based on your business processes and criticality of the asset? Are there known vulnerabilities out there in the dark web? Which potential APT groups are leveraging those vulnerabilities and as well as looking at what type of mitigations or controls that you have to either completely eliminate that vulnerability and such, right? That's a multidimensional risk assessment and prioritization that we are applying to give you with that.
Well,
Go ahead.
okay. But how am I consuming that information? Am I seeing a report? Am I looking at a Palo Alto Networks firewall console and going to a specific
Yeah.
screen to see what's going on? Or
Yeah. So that workflow is built into our IoT OT dashboard where you would be able to have complete visibility of those vulnerabilities in terms of which devices and which vulnerabilities. And then you are able to basically apply the compensating controls the way of the guided workflow process, right? To be able to take those vulnerabilities. You can start with obviously the highest priority vulnerability that's impacting your environment based on that asset severity and so on. And then there is a workflow that gets triggers from that dashboard work point of view to say, hey, for this particular vulnerability, given there is no existing, let's say, virtual patching that has been enabled, we would then be able to kind of go step by step to get the process and recommendations to go and then basically effectively take that virtual patching along with the zero trust policies to be applied onto the firewall. And then firewall administrator can then commit that to the running config during whatever maintenance window, right? Once that is committed on the firewall, now it is protecting all of a sudden for all the IoT, OT devices that match that criteria instead of having to touch individually one by one all those individual vulnerable devices.
So speaking of workflow, I'm curious about what you at Palo Alto Networks have seen with organizations that have this IT and OT. They tend to be sort of, separate domains, super siloed, frankly. So are the OT folks helping to inform the SecOps or the NetOps teams about the environment and about the risks, or is it just entirely on IT to sort of take care of this and just sort of hope that they've got everything correct? What's that workflow like between these two different teams?
That's a great question. So it depends on the organization and the maturity of their operations, really. But increasingly, we are seeing a great deal of collaboration and cooperation between the IT and OT teams because OT teams are not knowledgeable in the security aspects of it. At the same time, IT teams are knowledgeable with the operational devices and the impact of those devices to the business aspects of it. So there is a great deal of collaboration that's happening to be able to orchestrate these workflows to be effectively address these vulnerabilities. That there's a huge change in attitudes and as well as collaboration between those teams for sure.
You also mentioned compensating controls along the way as you were describing this, and coming from different shops where I had to do PCI support, a HIPAA support, a SOC support. You said compensating controls, and I've been triggered because the trick then is proving that to an auditor that your compensating controls are in place. So, is there a way with guided virtual patching that I can demonstrate to an auditor? Yeah, we've put these compensating controls in place in the form of these virtual patches.
Absolutely. So for every vulnerabilities that we identified, there is a audit log that gets captured in terms of when it was discovered, when somebody got assigned to it, what actions they have taken to either mitigate it or address that vulnerability. As you go through this compensating workflows, there is also basically the audit log that gets shown that shows basically when that virtual patching has been applied or compensating control has been applied broadly. That is a way basically you can also generate a report to say, hey, Mr. Auditor, this is basically the posture that we have identified the vulnerability. This is steps we have taken to address it, and these are the basically the times when that was happened as a kind of a report for addressing those specific reporting purposes. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about OT and IoT networks in the context of virtual patches and guided virtual patching. What other kind of environments are going to be appropriate here? I mean, you're aiming it at OT, and that's certainly the biggest need. But I could also see just a regular old data center that's got a bunch of servers and network devices in it and stuff. Is there a fit there as well?
I think virtual patching resonates in all verticals. Again, we are leading with industrial OT and medical IoT as the kind of main targets for customers because that's mission critical devices we are talking about, right? They cannot, their business depends on these devices to be working 24/7 nonstop so they can deliver the services and outputs that they are driving. But let's say if you now change that to a typical enterprise, IoT devices or BMS systems in their environment are not seen as business critical. However, that basically also means that there's not necessarily a designated owner that's going actively looking after the vulnerabilities and such, right? Or being able to patch or mitigate these vulnerabilities kind of takes a lot of time and process and being able to address them. Even for those type of environments, having the ability to apply a virtual patch in a broad stroke manner that can address hundreds of these devices in one go is a huge compelling value because, there are better things that many of our security teams or device owners will be looking to do for their day-to-day job, right? So anything.
It's a team size thing too, because depending on what kind of a shop you're in. If you're in a smaller shop, it's you or it's a few of you, and like, oh man, having to patch all these servers, it tends to fall down the list. So if you can put a compensating control, some kind of a mitigation in the form of a virtual patch that's easy to deploy and fairly low risk, that's better than like, how are we going to get all the patching done when it's just you're going to get there, but maybe you got six other things on your plate right now with deadlines. And can we just for now put this compensated control, this virtual patch in place, and that saves people time.
Absolutely, Ethan. That's rightly said. And a lot of times, some of the customers think about, hey, I'm going to segment these IoT, OT devices into their own separate network, and that way I don't have to worry about it, right? But we all know many of these IoT devices are combined with IT devices in the same subnets because of poor segmentation or because of the business process requires them to be intermingled and such, right? Because they are
I can
interacting with
neither confirm nor deny what I may or may not have done in the past with improperly segmenting my OT networks.
exactly.
It's a thing, it happens.
Yeah, and I mean, even however due diligence that you may be doing, sometimes these devices get accidentally placed in the same critical subnets as your IT and other systems, right? So
I had
one
guys plugging stuff in. It's like, what do you? I know it came up and it worked. You should have told me. That goes in a different VLAN. We have different policies surrounding that. Anyway,
exactly.
yes,
Yeah.
stuff
What's the
So
happens.
statute of limitations here?
yes, exactly. So people, processes, and technologies, right? Those are all kind of always working together. What I was trying to highlight is that with our network security platform and the built-in IDS, IPS solutions, powered by Precision AI, we are able to basically not only help identify customers, the devices that they have, identify what vulnerabilities exist on these devices, provide a way to virtually patch them, and effectively implement the zero trust and or least privilege access control policies, you are able to better protect your devices versus if you were to rely on NAC, for example, for doing segmentation, but they don't have any type of security monitoring or prevention technologies, you're obviously kind of settling for something less of a value in terms of being able to address all your security needs, right? That's something that I wanted to call out.
So who's going after OT systems and why? I can understand why cyber criminals might, want to encrypt a company's, storage systems because then they can extract ransomware. But what's the motivation for attacking OT systems?
Wow, there is many such problems in terms of state level actors going after OT systems for disrupting the operations or extracting ransomware. There's many different reasons for bad actors going after these OT systems, given they are directly impacting the business outputs. Because if a factory were to be compromised and down, we have all seen, right, Colonial Pipeline, for example, or many of the OT devices could be compensated because of their poor security posture. The impacts are immediate, and there are, countless reasons for kind of going after these OT devices.
Do you tend to see it being more sort of a state actor level thing or just sort of your standard cyber criminal?
all walks of cyber
You
criminals.
check all the boxes.
Yep. Unfortunately, all
Yeah.
walks of the cyber criminals.
Yeah. I've been reading articles lately about state actors going after, in a military sense, other networks and OT networks specifically. It's a form of military attack. So yeah, these are high profile targets for sure.
I don't want to sound speculative here, but if you've seen recently, even in 2024, attacks on water treatment facilities, water tanks that are in the middle of the city center, somebody hacked their valve that controls shut down the water flow into the tank being kind of left open, that causing the tank to overflow, or somebody trying to mix improper levels of chemicals into the water treatment plant. These are all potential problems that are lurking should there be a nation level attacks are happening. This could be triggered simultaneously in multiple parts of the country to cause huge distraction and panic in the people, right? I think that's all the more reasons, we want to be able to detect these things well ahead and be able to be ready in terms of having the right security tools in place.
Well, Kalyan, is there such a thing as a virtual patch lifecycle? I'm going to instantiate this thing, it's protecting me, but do I retire it at some point?
Yeah, there's certainly a life cycle to it. Again, virtual patching allows you to be able to quickly apply the patch when a known vulnerability comes to life. We can take care of this broadly, hundreds of thousands of these devices, right? Obviously, Palo Alto, from our best practices point of view, we continue to recommend customers to apply the actual software updates so that you're keeping a better hygiene of these devices and their security posture. But let's say if you were to come into a place where you're initially released a virtual patch that is alerting, and now you applied the patch. Now you no longer want to see unnecessary alerts because you know that this particular vulnerability has been addressed, right? Because that software patch has been applied on these devices. So you can naturally go to the process of removing that alerting because of patch that is already applied. Generally what we have seen with our customers is that they would go through this process of applying the IDS IPS for a class of devices, and they want to leave that enabled through the life cycle of those devices in their network, unless they kind of upgrade those devices and then they eventually retire those devices, right? There is certainly a life cycle around that.
Are you able to tie into vulnerability management systems? I'm thinking more on the sort of, IP device speaking side, not your OT mechanical control systems, that if I know I've patched this software, I can want to make sure that that information actually gets back into my IDS IPS rule set. So I can just trim out those rules and try not to get the whole rule set from getting so hairy.
If I understood your question right, you're trying to basically look at, now that the devices have been updated, I may have still lingering rules in the firewall that is applying certain type of virtual patching.
Right.
And
So if the vulnerability management team updated devices that I had put like virtual patch rules in the IPS for, is there like some kind of automation where even a ticket can be open to say, hey, next time you're, cleaning up the rule set in the IPS, you can take these out because we've patched.
yeah, those would go into the lifecycle management of these virtual patching. Typically, customers, what we have seen is that very rarely they would apply a specialized response to a given vulnerability. What we have seen is that customers are applying to say, hey, these are my business critical systems. I would either go and alert when a particular thing is coming in, or they would actively block the vulnerability, right? Because they got comfortable with active having the virtual patching applied using IDS IPS, and they would want to leave that in there so that ongoing basis these devices are protected as well.
Yeah, just thinking about that when I initially asked the question about the life cycle, it really does depend on the endpoint device, because only if the endpoint is actually patched would we all be comfortable with that virtual patch being removed.
Exactly.
Yeah, and in that OT environment that we've been stressing in this podcast, that's probably not happening all that often where those endpoints are being patched. So, the virtual patch life cycle is forever, and because that's
Much.
just the right way to do it. Keep
Yeah.
that protection in place. Yeah. Well, Kalyan, great discussion. Thank you for educating us on what virtual patching is and how guided virtual patching is different. And I also appreciate your AI comments and that you kept it real with what's really going on in there and the value that AI is actually bringing to virtual patching and guided virtual patching specifically. So Kalyan, if people want to find out more about the guided virtual patching announcement or just that technology in general, where would you send them?
Yeah, I think we can include or call the users to check out our industrial OT and IoT security solutions on Palo Alto website. You can do your favorite Google search or any other search that you want to look up, where you will find a lot of valuable resources in terms of what is our solution, how we go about passively discovering these devices and identifying the vulnerabilities and the risks that they bring to your organization. And there are even best practices that we publish in terms of how you take that visibility and understanding the risk and turn that into an action where you are able to effectively address those risks and reduce the attack surface and effectively implement the virtual patching and mitigate those risks. And along with that, there are a couple of blogs and recent press announcements that we have made, right, on the risk-based vulnerability prioritization for all your mission-critical devices, and as well as some of the latest, greatest innovations that we have released as part of our OT security solution. We can include those links in the podcast notes, I think, and we welcome you to basically check those links, and as well as why not take it for a test drive yourself. We have hands-on workshop and free trial options for customers that are interested in this to trying out and see this in real network of your own.
Well, we weren't going to include all those links in the show notes, but I guess we have to now, Kalyan.
Right.
Thank you for all of that. And indeed, we have several links from Palo Alto Networks discussing virtual patching and guided virtual patching and other resources for you so you can dig into the topic in more detail. And you will find all of that at packetpushers.net. Just click on the heavy networking link that's right on the front page, and it'll take you through our entire episode listing. You'll be able to find this episode very easily and dig in from there. And thank you for listening to Heavy Networking today. And if you talk to Palo Alto Networks to get more details about guided virtual patching, please let them know you heard about it on Packet Pushers. We would really appreciate it. Remember that Packet Pushers offers a lot for you via packetpushers.net. No login required. We're not tracking you across the World Wide Web. The site is not loaded with banner ads and other hot garbage. We're just sharing good information with you to make you a better engineer who stays right on top of what's going on in networking, cloud, and security, so that when that big project comes up at your place of employment, you are the most knowledgeable person in the room. We'd appreciate it if you tell your friends and colleagues about what we offer. That would be nice of you. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, you could send us a message at packetpushers.net/follow-up. Magical automation will send your message right through to our private Slack group. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.